A father's pride, a daughter's dream, and a ticket to her future. For 17-year-old Zoe Washington, the airport wasn't just a place of transit. It was the gateway to the rest of her life. In her bag, she carried a project of genius, a device that could change her destiny. But in the sterile, unforgiving light of the security checkpoint, one woman's suspicion would threaten to turn that dream into a nightmare. A gate agent, armed with a little bit of power and a whole lot of prejudice, would make a call she'd live to regret, never realizing that the quiet, brilliant girl she was targeting was the daughter of a man who dismantles real threats for a living. What happens when a petty tyrant tries to ruin an innocent life, only to come face to face with the full force of federal power? Stay with us. The air in Newark Liberty International Airport hummed with the familiar, chaotic symphony of travel. Announcements for flights to Dallas, London, and Tokyo echoed through the cavernous terminal sea, weaving through the rumble of rolling suitcases and the murmur of 1,000 different conversations. For 17-year-old Zoe Washington, this noise was the soundtrack of opportunity. Clutched in her hand was a boarding pass to San Francisco, a single piece of paper that felt heavier and more significant than a textbook. It was her ticket to the National Youth Innovators Symposium, a prestigious competition where her project was one of only 20 selected from across the country. She adjusted the strap of her heavy backpack, the weight a familiar comfort. Inside, nestled among foam padding and carefully secured wires, was her creation, the stochastic field modulator. It was a clunky, intimidating-looking device to the uninitiated, a web of copper coils, circuit boards, and blinking LEDs encased in a clear acrylic box. To Zoe, it was 2 years of late nights, burnt-out soldering irons, and the beautiful, elegant language of physics made manifest. It was her future. "You got everything, Zoe?" Zoe looked up at her father, Marcus Washington. He was a tall man with a presence that seemed to command space without any effort. He wore a simple gray suit, practical and unassuming, but his eyes missed nothing. They were kind, sharp, and right now, they were filled with a near-overwhelming sense of pride. "I think so, Dad," she said, her voice a little tight with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Double-checked the presentation slides. The modulator is packed as securely as I could get it. I even remembered my toothbrush this time." Marcus chuckled, a warm, low sound. "That's a definite improvement over the robotics fair last year. Your flight to Boston is at Gate 95, correct?" He pointed toward a different concourse. "Mine's over at 71. Short hop to DC for a couple of days of meetings." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "You're going to be amazing, Zoe. Just walk in there, explain your work with that brilliant mind of yours, and you'll blow them away. Don't even think about the other projects. Just focus on yours." "I'll try," she said, managing a small smile. "It's just, MIT and Caltech scouts will be there. It feels like my entire life is riding on this." "Your life is just beginning," he corrected softly. "This is an important step, but it's one of many. No matter what happens, I'm incredibly proud of the woman you are becoming. Smart, determined, kind. That's the real prize." He pulled her into a firm hug, the kind that had comforted her after scraped knees, failed tests, and teenage heartbreaks. "Now go on. Your gate is this way. Call me before you board and definitely when you land." "I will, Dad. Love you." "Love you more, kiddo." He watched her walk away, a lanky, brilliant girl with a backpack full of dreams, her confident stride a testament to the resilience he'd tried so hard to instill in her. He checked his watch, turned, and headed toward his own gate, a man comfortable with fading into the background, a ghost in the machine of everyday life. His work demanded anonymity. Today, however, that anonymity would be profoundly tested. Zoe navigated the snaking security line with practiced ease. She placed her laptop in one gray bin, her shoes and jacket in another. Finally, with a deep breath, she carefully lifted the stochastic field modulator from her backpack and placed it in its own bin, just as the TSA website had instructed for sensitive electronic equipment. As it rolled along the conveyor belt and disappeared into the X-ray machine, she felt a familiar pang of anxiety. "Please, just let this go smoothly." The TSA agent on the other side of the X-ray scanner, a young man named Peterson with a neatly trimmed beard, leaned closer to his screen, his brow furrowed. He reran the image, his fingers tapping on the console. He looked through the plexiglass at Zoe, who was waiting patiently after clearing the metal detector. "Ma'am," he called out, his tone neutral but firm. "Whose device is this?" "It's mine," Zoe said, stepping forward. The bin containing her project was diverted to a separate lane for manual inspection. Agent Peterson put on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. "Can you tell me what this is?" "It's a science project," Zoe explained calmly, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "It's a prototype stochastic field modulator. It demonstrates principles of quantum tunneling by manipulating localized energy fields." She knew the explanation sounded like gibberish to most people, but using precise language was her best defense. Peterson blinked, clearly out of his depth. He carefully swabbed the device for explosive residue, a standard procedure. "Stochastic. Okay." The swab came back clean. Still, he looked uneasy. The device was a mess of wires and unfamiliar components, unlike any laptop or game console he had ever seen. Protocol was protocol. "I'm going to need my supervisor to take a look at this." He spoke into his radio, and a few moments later, a woman in a slightly different uniform indicating a supervisory position strode over. Her name tag read K. Miller. She was a woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob and a mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval. Where Agent Peterson's demeanor was one of professional caution, Karen Miller's was one of immediate, undisguised suspicion. Her eyes didn't go to the device first. They went to Zoe. She took in the black teenager with her neat braids, her NASA sweatshirt, and the focused, intelligent look in her eyes. And in that split second, a narrative began to form in Karen's mind. A story written by 1,000 tiny prejudices she would never admit to having. "What's the problem here, Peterson?" she asked, her voice sharp and carrying across the checkpoint. "Unusual electronic device, ma'am. The passenger states it's a science project." Karen Miller looked down at the modulator, her nose wrinkling as if it smelled bad. She circled the inspection table, her gaze flicking between the complex array of circuits and Zoe's face. "A science project?" she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. She didn't address Zoe directly, speaking about her as if she weren't there. "Looks more like a homemade something." She left the final word hanging in the air, thick with insinuation. "It's perfectly safe," Zoe interjected, her politeness strained. "There's no power source connected, and the capacitors are fully discharged. I have the complete schematics and a letter from my physics professor, Dr. Alistair Finch from Princeton, explaining the project for the competition." She reached for her backpack to produce the letter, but Karen snapped at her. "Do not reach for your bag. Step back." Zoe froze, her hand hovering in the air. People in the security line were starting to stare. A flush of heat crept up her neck. This was wrong. This was escalating for no reason. "Peterson, what did she say it was called again?" Karen asked, tapping a pen against her clipboard. "A stochastic field modulator," she said. Karen let out a short, derisive laugh. "Right, a stochastic field modulator. And you expect us to believe that?" She finally turned her full accusatory glare on Zoe. "Where are you flying to today?" "San Francisco," Zoe said, her voice quiet but clear. "And what's the purpose of your trip?" The question was standard, but her tone made it an interrogation. "I'm a finalist in the National Youth Innovators Symposium. I'm presenting my research." Karen's eyes narrowed. The story was too neat, too perfect. The big words, the fancy competition. It felt rehearsed. In her experience, people who were hiding something often had elaborate stories. She saw a defiant teenager, not a young scientist. She saw a threat where there was only brilliance. "I'm going to need you to come with me," Karen said, her voice dropping into a low, authoritative register. "We're going to have a little chat in a more private setting." Zoe's heart pounded against her ribs. "I haven't done anything wrong. The device is harmless." "That's not for you to decide," Karen shot back, gesturing for another agent to watch her line. She picked up the modulator as if it were a venomous snake. "Bring your things and follow me. Now." The walk to the small windowless screening room felt like a mile. Every eye in the security area seemed to follow them. Zoe felt a hot mix of humiliation and anger. Her father's words echoed in her head. "No matter what happens, I am incredibly proud of you." She clung to that thought, a tiny life raft in a rising tide of injustice. The secondary screening room was as sterile and unwelcoming as a prison cell. It was small, painted a dull government-issue gray, with 2 hard plastic chairs and a metal table. Karen Miller placed the modulator on the table with a thud that made Zoe flinch. She then stood with her arms crossed, blocking the only door. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and accusation. "Let's start over," Karen began, her voice devoid of any warmth. "What is this thing really?" "I've already told you," Zoe said, trying to keep her voice even. "It's my research project. It explores the viability of generating micro-wormholes through controlled quantum fluctuations. The term stochastic refers to the randomly determined patterns it analyzes." Karen stared at her blankly for a second before her expression hardened into a scowl. "Stop with the $50 words. You think you're clever, don't you? Trying to talk your way out of this with a bunch of made-up nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Zoe insisted, her frustration mounting. "It's theoretical physics. I can show you my research paper. It's on my laptop. The letter from my professor is in my bag." "I'm sure it is," Karen sneered. "Anyone can type up a letter. How do we know this isn't some kind of trigger, a sophisticated detonator?" The word hung in the air, venomous and absurd. Detonator. Zoe's mind reeled. How had it come to this? From a simple security check to being accused of terrorism. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "That's a ridiculous accusation," Zoe said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "I am a student. I am a scientist. I am not a criminal." "You're a person of interest with an unidentifiable and potentially dangerous device in a federal facility," Karen countered, her voice rising. She was enjoying this, the power she held over this girl who thought she was so smart. "You're being uncooperative and evasive." "I'm not being evasive. I'm answering your questions." Zoe's voice cracked. She wouldn't cry. She refused to give this woman the satisfaction. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to channel her father's calm. What would he do? He would be methodical. He would be logical. "Okay," Zoe said, her tone shifting. "Let's be logical. The device was swabbed for explosives and came back negative. It has no internal power source. You can see for yourself there is no battery pack. It requires an external, high-amperage generator to even power on, which I certainly don't have in my luggage. Therefore, it poses zero threat in its current state. Those are the facts." Her calm, rational breakdown only seemed to infuriate Karen more. It was a challenge to her authority. "You're telling me how to do my job now?" Karen snapped. "You have no idea what this could be. It could be designed to interfere with the airport's navigation systems. It could be an EMP device. We don't know, and you refuse to give a straight answer." "A straight answer would be me repeating again that it is a science project," Zoe exclaimed, finally losing her composure. "What more do you want from me?" "I want the truth," Karen shouted, her face reddening. "And I'm not getting it from you." She took a step back, her eyes gleaming with a kind of righteous fury. This was her moment to be the hero, to stop a threat that everyone else had missed. She pulled out her radio, her thumb hovering over the transmit button. "You have one last chance to tell me what's really going on," she said, her voice low and menacing. Zoe stared at her, her mind racing. There was no reasoning with this woman. Logic had failed. Compliance had failed. This wasn't about security anymore. It was about power. It was about a woman who had looked at her and decided on sight that she was a threat. "I have nothing more to say to you," Zoe said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have told you the truth." A cruel smile touched Karen's lips. "Wrong answer. She pressed the button on her radio. "This is Supervisor Miller at Checkpoint Charlie. I have a non-compliant individual with a suspicious device in secondary screening room 2. I require police assistance, immediately." The static crackle of the radio's reply was the sound of Zoe's world tilting on its axis. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an official incident, a police incident, and she was right in the middle of it. The 10 minutes between the radio call and the officer's arrival felt like an eternity. Karen stood by the door, a smug sentinel, while Zoe sat in the hard plastic chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. She thought about her father at his gate, probably sipping a coffee, thinking everything was fine. She thought about the symposium, the judges, the life-changing opportunity that was slipping through her fingers with every passing second. The humiliation was a physical ache. The door opened, and a uniformed Port Authority police officer stepped in. He was a big man, with a thick neck and a weary expression that suggested he'd seen it all. His name tag read D. Riggs. "Supervisor Miller?" he asked, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Officer Riggs, thank you for the quick response," Karen said, her demeanor shifting to one of grave importance. This young woman was attempting to bring this device through security. She gestured dramatically toward the modulator. "She's given me multiple, conflicting stories about what it is, using a lot of technical jargon to try and confuse the issue. She's being highly uncooperative." Officer Riggs looked from Karen's self-satisfied face to the device, then finally to Zoe. His gaze was professional but heavy, colored by the supervisor's initial report. He was walking into a situation already framed for him. Suspicious device, uncooperative subject. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Zoe. "I'm Officer Donovan Riggs. I need you to tell me exactly what's going on here." "I've been trying to tell her," Zoe said, her voice tight with desperation. She stood up, wanting to be on his level. "My name is Zoe Washington. I am 17 years old. I am flying to San Francisco for a science competition. That device is my project. It is harmless. I have documentation to prove it, but your supervisor won't let me get it from my backpack." Riggs glanced at Karen. "Did you ask her for documentation?" She became agitated and started reaching for her bag. Karen lied smoothly. "For my safety and the safety of the checkpoint, I instructed her to stop." It was such a blatant twisting of the truth that Zoe gasped. "That's not what happened. I was calm. I told her I had a letter." "See?" Karen said to Riggs, shaking her head sadly. "This is what I've been dealing with. Hysteria, evasiveness." Riggs's expression didn't change. He was a creature of protocol. He saw a flustered teenager and a calm, authoritative supervisor. He sided with the uniform. "Miss Washington, I need you to calm down," he said, his tone firm. "Let's just take this one step at a time. What is the device for?" Zoe took a breath and repeated her explanation for the third time, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "It's a stochastic field modulator. It's a proof of concept for my research on quantum physics." Riggs's eyes glazed over at the technical terms. It sounded like gibberish to him too. "So what does it do?" "Right now, nothing. It's inert," Zoe said. "Theoretically, it could—" "Theoretically?" Karen interrupted. "So you admit it could do something?" "That's not what I—" "Officer, I'm not comfortable with this situation," Karen said, cutting her off again. "The device is unknown. The subject is agitated and giving answers that don't make sense. I believe we have grounds to detain her for further questioning and have the bomb squad analyze the device." Bomb squad. The words hit Zoe like a physical blow. This was a nightmare. Her project, her 2 years of work would be taken apart, possibly destroyed. She'd miss her flight. She'd miss the competition. Her future was being dismantled right in front of her by a woman on a power trip. "You can't do that," Zoe cried out, taking an involuntary step forward. Officer Riggs's hand immediately went to the butt of his sidearm. It wasn't an overt threat, just a reflexive, ingrained motion. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right where you are." The sight of his hand near his weapon shattered Zoe's last reserve of composure. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and angry. She was trapped. No one was listening. No one believed her. She was 17 years old, and she was being treated like a terrorist. "This is insane," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're ruining my life because you don't understand science." "I'm ensuring the safety of 300 passengers on the next flight out," Karen retorted sanctimoniously. "A job you clearly don't appreciate." Officer Riggs pulled out his notepad. "I need to see your ID, Miss Washington." Zoe's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket for her wallet, moving with slow, deliberate motions so as not to spook the officer again. She handed over her driver's license. Riggs looked at it, then back at her. "All right, Zoe, here's what's going to happen. We're going to escort you to our substation here in the airport. We're going to secure your property, the device, and we're going to ask you some more questions. If everything checks out, you'll be on your way." But Zoe knew it wouldn't be that simple. By the time everything checked out, her flight would be gone. The competition would start without her. The damage would be done. She felt a profound sense of helplessness wash over her. But then, through the fog of fear and anger, another thought pierced through. Her father. He had told her to call before she boarded. He was still here, in this airport. She had one call. She had to make it count. "Before we go anywhere," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I need to make a phone call. I'm a minor. I have a right to call my parent." Officer Riggs hesitated for a moment, then gave a slight nod. It was a reasonable request. "Fine, one call. Make it quick." Karen Miller looked annoyed by the delay but said nothing. She had already won. A phone call wouldn't change anything. She watched as Zoe pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, a smirk playing on her lips. The girl could call the president for all she cared. No one was getting her out of this. Zoe's thumb hovered over the contact photo of her and her dad at last year's 4th of July barbecue, his arms slung around her shoulder, both of them grinning. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each ring. "Please pick up. Please, please pick up." "Hey, Zoe, about to board?" His voice was calm, familiar, and so blissfully unaware of the storm she was in. Tears she'd been holding back now streamed freely down her cheeks, but her voice when she spoke was eerily calm, a trick she'd learned from him. When you're in trouble, control your voice, control your breathing. "Dad," she said, keeping her tone low and even. "I have a problem, a big one." On the other end of the line at Gate 71, Special Agent Marcus Washington stood up from his seat, his coffee forgotten on the table beside him. The shift in his daughter's tone was instantaneous and alarming. He could hear the carefully controlled tremor beneath the surface. This wasn't a lost wallet or a delayed flight. This was real trouble. "Talk to me, Zoe. Where are you?" he said, his voice dropping into a professional register. He was already walking, moving away from the noise of the boarding announcement. "I'm in a little room, off the main security checkpoint at Terminal C, near the United desks," she said, relaying the details as she saw them. "The supervisor, a woman named Miller, she thinks my modulator is a bomb. She's called the police. An officer is here. They're going to detain me." Karen Miller scoffed loudly enough for Marcus to hear her through the phone. "Tell your daddy he can meet you at the Port Authority station." Marcus's jaw tightened. He heard the woman's dismissive, smug tone. He heard the fear his daughter was trying so desperately to hide. "Zoe, listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice a blade of calm in the chaos. "Do not say another word to them. Do not answer any more questions. Hand the phone to the police officer." Zoe looked at Officer Riggs. "My father wants to speak with you." Riggs sighed, annoyed. "I don't need to talk to her father. This is an official police matter now." "He insists," Zoe said, holding out the phone. With a long-suffering look, Riggs took the phone. "This is Officer Riggs." "Officer Riggs." Marcus's voice came through the speaker, devoid of emotion but radiating an authority that made the officer stand a little straighter. "My name is Marcus Washington. I am my daughter's legal guardian. I am also in this airport. I am instructing you, as her father, to cease all questioning until I am present. Where is my daughter located specifically?" Riggs was taken aback by the man's tone. It wasn't angry or panicked. It was commanding. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a security situation." "I am aware," Marcus cut in, his voice like ice. "And you will be too very shortly. Now, for the last time, officer, give me your exact location, or this conversation is going to become significantly more complicated for you and for Supervisor Miller. I assure you." The veiled threat, delivered with such chilling calm, hit its mark. This wasn't some hysterical parent. Riggs felt the first prickle of unease. "We're in the secondary screening room behind checkpoint C2, Riggs said into the phone, his eyes flicking nervously toward Karen, who was watching with a frown. "I'll be there in 3 minutes, Marcus said. "Do nothing until I arrive." The line went dead. Riggs handed the phone back to Zoe. Something had shifted in the room. The officer's blustering certainty had evaporated, replaced by a tense watchfulness. Karen, however, was undeterred. "What's Daddy going to do? Come down here and lecture us?" she sneered. "Save it. By the time he gets here, you'll be in a holding cell." But Officer Riggs wasn't so sure. The name, Marcus Washington, tickled at the edge of his memory, but he couldn't place it. Still, the man's voice had carried the unmistakable weight of someone who was not used to being ignored. He decided for the moment to wait. Those 3 minutes stretched into an agonizing silence. Zoe stood by the table, her project a silent testament to her ambition, now a piece of evidence against her. Karen paced the small room like a caged animal, annoyed by the delay. Riggs stood by the door, listening to the sounds of the airport outside, a growing knot of apprehension in his stomach. Then, the door opened. Marcus Washington stepped inside. He wasn't out of breath from rushing. His suit was uncreased. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed to suck the air out of the room. His eyes, sharp and analytical, swept over the scene in a single glance. His daughter, her tear-streaked face, the sneering supervisor, the wary police officer, and the project on the table. He looked at Zoe first, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you okay?" She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. That was all he needed. His gaze then settled on Karen Miller. "I'm Marcus Washington," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You're the one who called the police on my 17-year-old daughter?" Karen Miller, accustomed to being the unquestioned authority in her small domain, was not easily intimidated. She had faced down furious parents whose toddlers had been subjected to pat-downs, arrogant businessmen furious about their expensive watches being swabbed, and self-important lawyers who quoted regulations they didn't understand. She saw the man who had just entered her screening room as merely the next in a long line of entitled people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. She sized him up instantly, her mind cataloging the data through a filter of ingrained biases. Expensive but understated suit, confident posture, articulate speech. A corporate lawyer, she decided. Probably thinks he can bully his way through this. She steeled herself, a familiar sense of righteous defiance solidifying her spine. "I'm Marcus Washington," he said, his voice dangerously soft, a low baritone that seemed to absorb the room's anxious energy rather than add to it. "You're the one who called the police on my 17-year-old daughter?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. Karen, however, chose to meet it with the full force of her institutional power. "I am Supervisor Miller. Yes," she declared, puffing out her chest slightly, a gesture of dominance. "And your daughter was brought here because she is in possession of a highly suspicious homemade electronic device and refused to cooperate with standard security procedures. My priority is the safety of this airport, not the feelings of a difficult teenager." Marcus's eyes, which had been fixed on her, flickered to the modulator on the table. He took a slow, deliberate step towards it, his movements fluid and devoid of any aggression, yet they held Karen's and Riggs's attention completely. He didn't touch the device, not yet. He simply studied it, his gaze analytical. Then his eyes returned to Karen, and his expression was unreadable, a calm that was far more unnerving than any rage could have been. She refused to cooperate? He asked, his voice a quiet counterpoint to her strident tone. Or you refuse to listen? My daughter is many things. Brilliant, focused, perhaps a little stubborn. But she is not uncooperative. She understands the importance of rules. So tell me, Supervisor Miller, what specific questions did you ask that she refused to answer? She gave me a nonsensical story about stochastic modulators and quantum physics. Karen scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. A bunch of $50 words meant to confuse and obstruct. I'm responsible for identifying potential threats, Mr. Washington, not for deciphering science fiction. I see. Marcus nodded slowly as if she had just confirmed a vital piece of information. He then did something that completely disarmed her. With a gentleness that bordered on reverence, he reached out and carefully turned the stochastic field modulator on the table, his fingers tracing the edge of the acrylic case. It was the complete opposite of how Karen had handled it, as if it were a piece of garbage or a venomous creature. My daughter, he began, his voice still deceptively mild, is a finalist in the National Youth Innovators Symposium, a competition that awards scholarships to the most promising young scientific minds in the country. Her project, which you've dismissed as a fairy tale, is the result of a 2-year research grant program sponsored by Princeton University's Department of Physics. He paused, letting the name of the institution hang in the air. The documentation for all of this, including a letter of verification from the department head, Dr. Alistair Finch, is in her backpack. The same backpack you apparently refused to let her open. That seems like a curious oversight for someone so concerned with procedure. He pointed to a specific component on the circuit board, his finger hovering just above the clear case. This is a standard 470 microfarad electrolytic capacitor. You can buy it on Amazon. That is a Raspberry Pi 4B motherboard, the heart of 1 million high school robotics projects. These are simple copper coils wound by hand. There is no power source, no remote receiver, and absolutely nothing in this assembly that could be remotely construed as dangerous by anyone with a rudimentary understanding of electronics. It is, exactly as she told you, a science project. An exceptionally advanced one, but a science project nonetheless. A fact you could have ascertained in less than 5 minutes if you had chosen to listen instead of to profile. The word landed with the force of a physical blow. Profile. Karen's face, already flushed with indignation, turned a deep mottled shade of crimson. How dare you? She sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. This has nothing to do with that. This is about security. I am a federal contractor tasked with protecting the American people. Then let's talk about your duties, Marcus said, his calm unwavering as he turned his full attention to Officer Riggs. The officer, who had been watching this exchange with the growing dread of a man realizing he'd wandered into a minefield, stiffened. Officer, Marcus began, his tone shifting from paternal correction to something more akin to a legal deposition. What was the specific articulable threat articulated by Supervisor Miller that justified the involvement of law enforcement? Riggs swallowed hard. The official jargon made him feel exposed. She reported a suspicious device, sir, and a non-compliant passenger. A passenger who is a 17-year-old minor, Marcus added, his eyes locking onto Riggs's. Tell me, Officer Riggs, upon your arrival, did you make an independent assessment of the situation? Did you ask to see the documentation my daughter repeatedly offered to provide? Did you attempt to de-escalate? Or did you accept the narrative provided by a civilian supervisor and immediately proceed as if my daughter's guilt was a foregone conclusion? What steps did you take to verify that a threat actually existed before you contributed to the potential detainment of a child? Officer Riggs opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had done none of those things. He had walked in, seen a flustered black teenager and a confident uniformed supervisor, and he had made a swift, damning assumption. He had followed the path of least resistance, and he now realized that path led directly off a cliff. Karen, seeing her authority eroding and her police backup wavering, decided on a final, desperate gambit. She would reassert control. "That's enough," she shouted, her voice sharp and brittle. "I am the ranking official for this checkpoint. This man is interfering with a federal security screening and intimidating a police officer. Officer Riggs, I am instructing you to remove this man. Now." It was the ultimate overplay of a losing hand. She believed in that last foolish moment that the uniform and title she wore were an impenetrable shield. Marcus Washington simply stared at her, and for the first time a flicker of something other than calm appeared in his eyes. It was a look of profound, weary pity. "You still don't get it, do you, Miss Miller?" He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his motion slow, deliberate, and utterly devoid of threat. He wasn't reaching for a phone or a wallet to pay a bribe. The movement was practiced, economical. He retrieved a black tri-fold leather wallet. He didn't flash it. He opened it with a quiet flick of his wrist and held it out for them to see. The room, already tense, fell into a deep, echoing silence. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and a muffled, distant announcement for a flight to Chicago. Inside the wallet, recessed in a custom-cut window, was a gleaming gold shield, intricately detailed and unmistakable. Beside it, under the seal of the Department of Justice, was a laminated identification card. The photo showed Marcus's face, serious and official. The text below it was stark and absolute. "Special Agent Marcus Washington," he said, his voice dropping back to that terrifyingly soft tone, letting them read the final damning lines for themselves. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, National Security Branch, Counterterrorism Division." The silence that followed was a physical presence. It was the sound of a world cracking apart. Karen Miller's jaw went slack. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a pasty, shocked pallor. Her eyes, wide with horror, darted from the golden shield to Marcus's unyielding face and back again, her mind utterly refusing to process the reality of the situation. This wasn't a lawyer. This wasn't a businessman. This was the real thing. She hadn't just antagonized a father. She had obstructed a federal agent from the one division she claimed to be helping. Officer Donovan Riggs felt a wave of icy dread wash over him, so intense it made him feel nauseous. The name and the division clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He wasn't just in trouble with internal affairs. He was on the radar of a man who hunted actual terrorists for a living. A man who could, with a single phone call, ruin his career, his reputation, and his life. Marcus held the credentials for a moment longer, ensuring the message was received. Then, with another quiet flick of his wrist, he closed the wallet and slipped it back into his jacket. The symbol of power was gone, but its effect lingered, a permanent alteration of the room's atmosphere. "Now," he said, and the word cut through the shocked stillness. "Let's start over. Supervisor Miller, I'm going to need your full name and your employee ID number. Officer Riggs, I will be expecting a copy of your full, unredacted incident report and any and all body camera footage from this interaction on my desk by noon tomorrow. My daughter will now retrieve her documentation from her backpack to place it on the official record. She will then be collecting her property, and we will be proceeding to her gate so she can make her flight. Is any single part of that sequence of events unclear to you?" Karen stood frozen, a statue of shattered arrogance, completely speechless. Officer Riggs, however, snapped to attention as if a general had just walked into the room. The weary cynicism was gone, replaced by the rigid formality of a man desperate to mitigate a catastrophe. "No, sir," he said, his voice crisp and deferential. "Crystal clear, Agent Washington." He turned to Zoe, his entire demeanor transformed. "Ma'am, please go ahead and get your papers." The word "ma'am," addressed to the teenager he was about to detain, was laced with a level of respect that bordered on panic. The unraveling was complete. Power had not just shifted, it had revealed itself in its true and final form. The arrival of the airline's terminal manager was not a grand entrance. David Henderson, a man whose professional life was a series of carefully managed fires, scurried into the small gray room looking harried, his tie slightly askew. His face was a practiced mask of managerial concern, a look he had perfected for dealing with everything from lost luggage to medical emergencies. He had been summoned by a clipped, panicked radio call from Officer Riggs that mentioned a significant security issue and federal involvement. He was expecting a bureaucratic jurisdictional dispute, perhaps a problem with a diplomat's luggage. He was not prepared for the scene of absolute, silent devastation that greeted him. The air in the room was thick and cold, heavy with the aftermath of a storm. A Port Authority officer stood against the wall, his posture rigid, his face pale. A young woman, her eyes red-rimmed but her expression now one of fierce composure, stood beside a complex-looking device on the table, and a man in a simple gray suit, who Henderson initially mistook for a lawyer, radiated an aura of such profound and controlled fury that Henderson felt an involuntary shiver of apprehension. This was not a fire to be managed. This was a nuclear meltdown in progress. "Agent Washington," Officer Riggs said, his voice strained, a formal introduction that was also a clear warning to Henderson. "This is David Henderson, the United Airlines terminal manager." Henderson, falling back on years of corporate training, extended a clammy hand and deployed his most calming customer service smile. "Sir, I'm David Henderson. I want to apologize profusely for any misunderstanding. My name is on the door here, so this is my responsibility. Let's figure out how we can de-escalate this and get you and your daughter on your way." Marcus Washington didn't even glance at the offered hand. He met Henderson's eyes, and the manager's smile faltered, wilting under the intensity of that gaze. "Your time for de-escalation, Mr. Henderson, was 30 minutes ago," Marcus said, his voice level and dangerously calm. "It was when your senior security supervisor, Miss Miller here, decided to profile my 17-year-old daughter. De-escalation would have been listening to her clear, repeated explanations. It would have been accepting her offer to provide verifying documentation. Instead, your employee chose a path of baseless accusation, intimidation, and escalation that resulted in her calling an armed police officer to confront a child. So you will forgive me if I am not interested in your corporate platitudes. You're not dealing with a disgruntled customer. You are dealing with the consequences of your employee's actions." He picked up the letter from the table, the one Zoe had finally been allowed to retrieve, and held it out for Henderson to take. "This is from Dr. Alistair Finch. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's a Nobel laureate in physics from Princeton University. He seems to believe my daughter's work, which Miss Miller here dismissed as a fairy tale and a potential bomb, is worthy of his personal recommendation. Read it." Henderson's hands trembled slightly as he took the paper. His eyes scanned the prestigious letterhead, the dense complimentary text, and the eminent signature at the bottom. The blood drained from his face. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a catastrophic, multi-level failure. He looked from the letter to the brilliant, intimidating device, then to Karen Miller, who was now visibly trembling, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood. "Karen," Henderson whispered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and horror. "What in God's name did you do?" I was following protocol," she stammered, her voice a high-pitched, desperate squeak. It was the last defense of a woman who knew she was cornered. "The device was unidentifiable. I made a judgment call to ensure passenger safety. It was my duty." "Your duty," Marcus interjected, his voice cutting through her frantic excuses, "is to assess threats, not invent them. You made a judgment call based on prejudice. You saw a young black woman with something you didn't understand, and you leaped to the most sinister, most insulting conclusion possible. You didn't seek to understand. You sought to convict, and now your company will answer for it." He turned his full attention back to the terrified manager. "I will be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration. My office will be in contact with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey to request a full review of their partnership with your airline security contractors. I will also be speaking to my own agency's legal counsel about a potential civil rights investigation into the training, hiring, and screening practices of your employees here at Newark Liberty. To that end, I want Miss Miller's complete employment history, including all performance reviews and a record of every passenger complaint filed against her, regardless of its resolution." I want the names of every single employee who witnessed this event and failed to intervene. This will be an official request, Mr. Henderson. I suggest you comply." Each sentence was a precisely aimed legal missile, and Henderson could see his career and a significant chunk of his company's reputation going up in smoke. Marcus then shifted his gaze to the silent police officer. "And you, Officer Riggs, your staggering failure to perform even the most basic due diligence is a disgrace to your uniform. You are sworn to protect and serve, not to act as the private muscle for any petty tyrant with a name tag. You escalated a situation involving a minor without asking a single critical question. Your actions could have had tragic consequences. Be expecting a call from your Internal Affairs Division. I will be giving them a very detailed statement." Riggs just gave a short, sharp nod, his face grim. He knew his career was now permanently stained. He had made the worst mistake a cop can make. He had picked the wrong side. Finally, Marcus's posture softened almost imperceptibly as he turned to his daughter. The federal agent receded, and the father returned. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice now carrying a different kind of authority, the absolute command of a parent. "My daughter's flight to San Francisco boards in 20 minutes. You will personally escort her to gate C-127. You will ensure she boards that plane ahead of everyone else. You will speak to the captain and the head flight attendant, explain the disgraceful ordeal your company has put her through, and instruct them that she is to be treated with the utmost courtesy and respect for the remainder of her journey. The airline will be upgrading her to the first available seat in first class. This is not a request. It is a small, insufficient but necessary first step in your company's apology to my child." Henderson nodded frantically, his head bobbing like a buoy in a storm. "Yes, of course, absolutely, immediately. Miss Washington, if you'll please come with me." Zoe carefully placed her stochastic field modulator back into her padded backpack, the weight on her shoulders feeling profoundly lighter. She zipped the bag, her movements sure and steady now. She looked at Karen Miller one last time. The woman who had wielded her power with such smug cruelty just minutes ago now looked like a ghost. Her face was hollow, her eyes wide and vacant, staring at the ruin of her own making. Zoe felt no flicker of triumph, no surge of satisfaction. There was only a deep, draining sadness for the waste of it all. As she walked toward the door, her father placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. He stepped aside to let her and Henderson pass, but he remained in the room for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Karen. "You wanted to be a hero today, Miss Miller," Marcus said, his voice a low, chilling whisper that was meant only for her and the disgraced officer. "You went hunting for a monster, but the only monster in this room was the one you brought with you." He turned and walked out, leaving Karen Miller to collapse into one of the hard plastic chairs, the sound of her own ragged breathing the only thing filling the suffocating silence. The aftermath was as swift and merciless as Marcus's judgment. Karen was immediately placed on administrative leave. 2 days later, she was summoned to a sterile corporate office where David Henderson, flanked by an HR representative and a company lawyer, read a prepared statement terminating her employment for gross misconduct and failure to adhere to established professional standards. Her desperate appeals and threats of a lawsuit were met with a cold silence. She had made herself a liability, and the corporation cut her loose without a second thought. The story inevitably leaked. An airline employee who witnessed Zoe being led away and later saw the terminal manager's panicked response sold the story to a blog. Within hours, it was a firestorm. #JusticeForZo trended on Twitter. United Airlines was buried under an avalanche of public fury. Their carefully worded public apology, which spoke of an unfortunate incident and a commitment to ongoing training, was dissected and ridiculed for its passive, evasive language. Officer Donovan Riggs faced a grueling internal affairs review. He sat for hours while investigators picked apart his every action, his body camera footage playing on a large screen like a movie of his own failure. He was officially cleared of violating any laws, but the reprimand in his permanent file was scathing, citing a severe lack of independent judgment and failure to follow de-escalation protocols involving a minor. He was reassigned from the high-profile airport detail to a precinct in the furthest, quietest corner of the city, a professional exile. Marcus and Zoe accepted a quiet, out-of-court settlement from the airline. The next day, Marcus transferred the entire amount to the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, earmarking it for scholarships for young women of color pursuing degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math. It was never about the money. It was about the principle. And Zoe, she won. After landing in San Francisco, she walked into the symposium the next morning feeling as if she had aged a year and a day. When it was her turn to present, she stood before the panel of esteemed judges, her modulator humming beside her. She didn't just recite her research. She spoke with a fire and a newfound authority, her voice ringing with the passion of a young scientist who had fought for her right to be there. Her ordeal had not broken her. It had forged her. When they announced her name for first place, the prize including a full-ride scholarship to her dream school, MIT, the applause felt distant. The true victory, she realized, had already been won in that small gray room in Newark. Weeks later, sitting on the back porch with her father as twilight settled over their quiet neighborhood, she finally found the words for it. "I saw what powerlessness feels like, Dad," she said, her voice soft. "It's cold and small. And then I saw what real power looks like. It wasn't your badge. It wasn't your title. It was your calm. It wasn't loud. It was just true. That's what won." Marcus looked at his daughter, the brilliant young woman who could see the hidden architecture of the universe and the subtle mechanics of justice. "The badge just gets them to listen, Zoe," he said, a proud, warm smile touching his lips. "The truth is, what does the rest? What you just heard isn't just a story about an airport. It's a story about the quiet, insidious nature of prejudice and the terrifying speed at which a small abuse of power can spiral out of control." Zoe Washington walked into that terminal with a dream, only to be met by a nightmare of suspicion simply because of how she looked. But it's also a story of karmic justice, a reminder that you never truly know who you're dealing with. Karen Miller thought she was targeting a powerless teenager. She had no idea she was provoking a man whose entire life is dedicated to distinguishing real threats from imagined ones. If Zoe's strength and her father's quiet, decisive justice resonated with you, please help us share this story. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas where karma doesn't forget an address. What did you think of Marcus's response? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.